The air in the Galactic Council chamber did not move. It was processed and still, carrying no scent, no humidity, nothing that might offend 1,000 different biologies. Light came from everywhere and nowhere, softly illuminating the vast circular room. In tiered seating that rose like a gentle mountain, the delegates watched. There were beings of chitin and carapace, their eyes like dark jewels. There were forms of swirling, conscious gas contained within shimmering fields. There were creatures of living crystal that caught the light and broke it into quiet rainbows on the walls. It was a gallery of the galaxy's success stories. Today, they would review the final candidate for membership, humanity. The presiding officer was Counselor Vel, an ancient being from a reptilian species. His scales were the color of old bronze, and his movements were slow, considered. He spoke, his voice translated directly into the minds of all present. The agenda proceeds. Item 7432. Application for galactic integration, species designation. Human, planet, Earth, Sol system. A soft murmur, like wind through distant reeds, moved through the chamber. Humans were known but barely. They were clever, fast learners, aggressive in their early space exploration but recently more careful. Their application had been pending for a long, long time. Many expected them to fail. Their history was messy. Ambassador Miho of Earth may present the summary of qualification. Vel intoned from a small, plain archway at the chamber's base. Two figures walked out. They looked terribly simple. Two bipeds, clothed in dark, formal suits without decoration. The man Miho was middle-aged with a calm, lined face. His hair was gray at the temples. Beside him, a younger woman, Jisoo, carried a small metallic case. Her eyes were sharp, taking in the impossible array of life above them, but her hands were steady. They stopped in the center of the open floor, the focus of a silent, alien galaxy. Miho bowed his head, not deeply, but respectfully. Counselor Vel, esteemed delegates, thank you for the opportunity to stand before you. His voice was translated. It sounded flat, devoid of the musical tones some species used or the complex chemical signals others relied on. We have observed the presentations of other applicant species, Miho continued. We have seen wonders of stellar engineering, proofs of perfect societal harmony, demonstrations of profound philosophical unity. They were magnificent. He paused. The chamber waited. Humanity cannot present such things, not because we lack achievement, but because we believe it tells you nothing of who we are. Achievement can be borrowed. Technology can be stolen. A perfect society can be a very small one. Another soft murmur. This was not the standard opening. A few delegates shifted, their forms rustling or humming. So we will not show you our ceiling, Miho said, his voice growing firmer. We will show you our foundation, the thing we built ourselves upon after we nearly broke ourselves. He nodded to Jisoo. She placed the case on the smooth floor, entered a code, and opened it. Inside, cushioned on dark fabric, was not a data crystal, not a holographic projector, not a weapon or a tool. It was a book. A simple physical object. Its cover was faded leather, worn at the edges. It looked fragile. Confusion rippled through the council. Visual sensors focused on the object. A book, paper, organic material. It was prehistoric. This is an artifact from our past, Miho explained. A diary contains a true story from our home world. It is the story of how we learned the weight of a world and the cost of an empty sky. Counselor Vel leaned forward, his old eyes narrowing. You wish to present a historical narrative as your qualification? We wish to present our understanding of consequence, Miho replied. To be human is to carry this story. It is the first lesson we teach our children about the universe. Not a lesson of power, but of loss. He looked around at the silent, staring delegates. With the council's permission, I will tell it to you now. The records are there for you to verify. Every word is true. Vel was silent for a long moment. Protocol was being shattered. But curiosity, a universal trait, had been ignited. He gave a slow, single nod. Proceed. Miho carefully lifted the diary from the case. He did not open it. He knew the words by heart. Jisoo took a small step back, her expression solemn. The story is not one of war, though war is in it. It is not one of hate, though hate played a part. It is a story of life, and then of absence. Miho took a slow breath. The chamber lights began to dim at his unspoken request, leaving him in a soft pool of light. The title of this story, he said, his voice now the only sound in the immense, dark space, filled with beings who had mastered stars, is The Last Passenger Pigeon. He let the words hang. They meant nothing to the assembly. Passenger? A pigeon? Sounded small, insignificant. To understand the end, Miho said, you must first understand the beginning. You must understand what a sky full of life looks like. So let me tell you about the flocks. Let me tell you about the noise that was like the world breathing. Let me tell you about the time when the pigeons were not a memory, but a fact of the world, more constant than the mountains. And in the darkness, the delegates listened. They waited for tales of engines and empires. They did not know they were about to hear a story of a bird, and they could not yet imagine why it would matter more than any weapon ever could. The silence in the chamber was complete, heavy with waiting. The presentation of Earth had begun not with a roar, but with the turning of a page in a very old book. In the dark council chamber, Miho's voice was calm and clear. He did not use fancy words. He painted pictures with simple sentences. Our world, Earth, had a place called North America. This was in the year 1850 by our old calendar. The land was vast. Forests seemed to go on forever. And in those forests, there was a bird, the passenger pigeon. He paused, letting the translators work. You must forget the idea of a single bird or a small flock. You must try to imagine a number so big it loses meaning. Their groups were called flocks, but that word is too small. It was a river of life in the sky. Miho began to describe it. He talked about a young man named Young-soo. He was not a famous leader or a great inventor. He was just a person who lived on the edge of a great forest. One morning, Young-soo heard a strange sound coming from the east. It started as a low hum like distant machinery. But there was no machinery. Young-soo walked outside, Miho said. The sound grew. It became a rumble, like faraway thunder. But the sky was clear and blue. He looked up. In the minds of the listening delegates, an image began to form. The insectoid Vri, who understood swarms, felt a flicker of recognition. The first birds appeared at the horizon. A dark smudge. In minutes, the smudge became a cloud. Then the cloud covered the whole sky. Not just a part of it. All of it. From one side of the world to the other, there was no blue. Only the beating of wings. Miho spoke of the numbers. Thousands? Millions? More. Billions. The pigeons did not just fly over. They kept coming. For hours. Then for a day. Then for 2 days. The sun was blocked. The forest below became a strange, moving twilight. The sound was deafening. A constant roaring wind made of feathers and heartbeats. Young-soo stood by his small house, Miho continued. He could feel the wind from their wings on his face. It was a warm, living wind. Twigs and leaves fell from the trees above, shaken loose by the constant motion. The air smelled of bird, of forest, of something wild and endless. He described the birds themselves. They were not colorful or fancy. They were blue-gray on top, with warm red breasts. Their eyes were bright and black. They flew with a purpose, a direction. They were a single thing made of countless parts. A delegate from a species that lived in vast, migrating schools in liquid methane gave a soft pulse of light. They understood the scale of movement. When they landed to rest in the forests, Miho said, his voice dropping slightly, the trees suffered. Branches the size of a human body would snap under the weight. It was not malice. It was simply the fact of them. Their droppings fell like rain, covering the ground, feeding the soil. They were a force of nature, like a hurricane made of flesh and blood. To humans of that time, they were a fact. They were like the sunrise. You did not imagine a world without them. It would be like imagining a world without air. He let that idea sit in the quiet chamber. The impossibility of absence. For many delegates, whose species had never caused their own mass extinctions, the concept was strange. Life, in such overwhelming abundance, was a constant. Young Su watched for the entire first day, Miho said. He felt small, not afraid but humble. He knew he was seeing something bigger than his town, bigger than his country. This was a moving piece of the world itself. At night, the moon would sometimes shine through a break in the living cloud. It would show a glimpse of countless, silvery wings, all moving together. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was life in its most powerful, simple form. More and more and more. Miho stopped speaking for a moment. The only sound was the faint, ambient hum of the council chamber's life support. "That is what we lost," he said, his voice very soft now. "Not just a bird. We lost a more. We lost a sound that shook the trees. We lost a wind that came from living wings. We lost a fact of the world." He looked down at the old diary in his hands, though no one could see it in the dark. "The people of that time had a saying," Miho said. "They said the flocks were inexhaustible. They believed the number was so big human activity could never touch it. The end was not in their imagination. Why would it be? When you stand in an ocean, you do not think you can drink it all." He lifted his head again, though he addressed the story, not the council. "But we did not just stand in the ocean," he said. "We built pumps. We built pipes. We built a machine to drink it, and we turned it on." The pleasant, awe-filled image of the great flock began to dissolve in the listeners' minds. A sense of dread, slow and cold, started to creep in. Where was this story going? What was the machine? Miho's next words were plain and heavy. The machine had many parts. It was not made of metal and gears. It was made of ideas, of markets, of networks, of hunger and progress. The first part was the telegraph. Wires that carried messages across the land in moments. This is where our story turns. The darkness in the chamber no longer felt like a theater. Felt like the space before a storm. The delegates waited. They were no longer just curious. They were unsettled. They had been shown a miracle of natural abundance. And the human had just promised to show them how it was dismantled. The great, thundering sky of pigeons was gone from Miho's story. Now he began to speak of clicking wires, of distant cities, and of numbers on a ledger. The foundation he was laying was not one of pride, but of a mistake so large it had once darkened the sky. And the galaxy listened, beginning to understand that the shock was not in what humanity had built, but in what they had broken and chosen never to forget. Miho's voice in the dark chamber lost its tone of wonder. It became steady, factual. It was the voice of someone reading a report. "The telegraph," he said. It was a system of metal wires on tall poles. Could send words, as simple codes of clicks, across a continent in minutes. It was a great human invention for communication. He paused, letting the concept settle. For many delegates, such primitive technology was archaeology. But they understood its power, instant connection over distance. The pigeons ate nuts from the forests, beech trees, acorns. When a large flock would settle in a new area to feed, it was an event. It would ruin farmers' crops just by its size. In the past, news of this would travel slowly. By the time hunters arrived, the birds might be gone. A shift occurred in the story. The image of the majestic, thundering flock began to be overlaid with a new, cold grid. Now, with the telegraph, it worked like this. A farmer named Mr. Park, seeing the birds descend, would go to the small-town telegraph office. He would send a message down the wire. "Pigeons here. Million. Tell the hunters." The operator, a young woman named Mira, would tap the message out. It would go to cities, to newspapers, to market offices. Miho described Mira. She was not evil. She was good at her job. She liked the tapping sound of the key. She was proud to connect people. She did not think of the birds as a dying wonder. She thought of them as a fact, and her job was to report facts. In the city, men like Mr. Kim would read the message, Miho continued. Mr. Kim was a market hunter. He shot animals to sell their meat. He had a family to feed. He was a good shot. He saw the message not as an invitation to destroy, but as an opportunity to work, to provide. The pigeons were a resource, like coal in the ground or fish in the sea, a resource that moved. The telegraph told you where it was. The logic was laid out step by simple step. It was not the logic of a monster. It was the logic of a system. Need, meeting information, meeting efficiency. Mr. Kim and hundreds like him would get on the new trains, Miho said. Another invention. They could travel fast across distances that once took weeks. They arrived with guns and nets and sticks. They arrived where the birds were, because the wires had told them. The description of the hunt was not dramatic. It was mechanical. Men would wait at the edges of a roosting forest at dusk. When the birds settled, covering every branch, the men would light torches. The birds, startled, would fly up, but only into the dark branches above. They were confused. Then the men would use long poles, Miho said, his voice flat. They would simply knock the birds from the branches. One man could knock hundreds to the ground in minutes. Others would shoot into the crowded sky. A single shot could kill many birds. There was no sport, no challenge. It was harvesting. The delegates listened. The silica beings, who experienced time slowly, felt a deep, cold unease. This was not a battle. This was not a conflict. This was processing. The birds on the ground were gathered. They were packed into barrels, wooden containers. Sometimes they were packed alive. Hundreds in a barrel. The barrels were loaded back onto the trains. The trains took them to the cities. To New York, Chicago, Boston. Miho began to list numbers. They were just numbers, but they piled up. In one county, over a few weeks, hunters shipped 700,000 birds. In one season, a single sporting club might kill 50,000 for fun. In a single day, at a big roost, tens of thousands could be taken. Every year, for decades, the number was in the millions. Then the hundreds of millions. The numbers hung in the air. They were abstract, but Miho connected them. Think of the sky young Su saw, he said. A sky so full it blocked the sun for 2 days. Now think of that sky, but with a hole punched in it. Then another. Then another. The holes were small at first, but the punches kept happening. Every telegram, every train trip, every barrel was another punch. He described the market in the city. The barrels were opened. The pigeons, often still alive, were pulled out. Their heads were snapped. They were sold for food. They were cheap, penny a bird. They were food for the poor, for slaves, for pigs. The great, thundering force of nature was reduced to a cheap commodity. And still, no one believed it could end, Miho said, a faint tone of amazement in his voice, as if even he struggled to understand it. The flocks were so big that even after seeing smaller numbers, people thought it was just the birds being somewhere else. The idea that they could be gone was a silly idea, a laughable idea. The ocean could not be drunk. But the machine was working. The telegraph network was the nervous system. The railroads were the arteries. The market demand was the hunger. And the hunters were the hands. It was not one evil man, Miho stressed. Mr. Kim was feeding his children. Mira was doing her job well. The farmer, Mr. Park, was warning of a crop nuisance. The system was made of ordinary people making ordinary choices, connected by new tools. The tragedy was not in the heart. It was in the math. The rate of taking was higher than the rate of giving. And for a long, long time, the giving had seemed infinite. The darkness in the chamber was heavy. The story had turned from a magnificent natural spectacle to a dry, chilling lesson in economics and networks. The pigeons were not being defeated. They were being logged, transported, and sold. Their extinction was being booked in ledgers and train schedules. The sound of thunder began to fade, Miho said quietly. The great flocks broke into smaller flocks. The smaller flocks became rare sights. People began to talk with concern about where the pigeons had gone. They made laws too late. They tried to protect the last ones too late. The machine had a momentum. It was hard to stop. He took a slow breath. The next part was coming. The part after the machine had done its work. The part where the ocean was finally, visibly, almost empty. "And so we come to the last one," Miho said. "Her name was Martha, and she lived in a cage." The silence in the council chamber was deep now. The story of the great flocks and the efficient machine that dismantled them had left a cold feeling. Miho's voice, when he spoke again, was softer. It was no longer describing a system. It was describing a single life. "By the year 1914, he said, the thunder was gone. The sky was just sky again. People could look up and see only clouds or sun or stars. The passenger pigeon was a memory. For most people, it was a story told by grandparents. I once saw a sky so full," they would say. Young people would nod, but they could not really understand. He let that idea sit. A whole generation growing up in a quieter, emptier world, unable to even imagine the noise that had once been normal. But there were a few left. Not flocks, just birds. In zoos, in private collections. People finally understood the value of what was vanishing. They tried to breed them. They hoped to bring them back. But it was too late. The groups were too small. The knowledge of how they lived in their billions was gone. Miho's words painted a sad, lonely picture. A species that thrived in unimaginable numbers could not survive in dozens. They were social creatures. They needed the crowd to feel right, to trigger their instincts to breed. In a cage, they were just confused. The last known one was a female. She was born in captivity. She had never flown in a wild flock. She had never felt the wind of a million wings. She lived her whole life in an enclosure at the Cincinnati Zoo. The humans who cared for her named her Martha. He said the name with care. It was a simple, human name. It made her a person, not a specimen. Martha was older. Her feathers were a bit dull. She moved slowly. She spent her days on a perch. She ate food given to her by a zookeeper. His name was Quan. Miho described Quan. He was a gentle man who loved animals. He knew exactly what Martha was. He knew she was an ending. His job was not to keep her healthy for release, but to keep her comfortable until there was no more her. Quan would clean her enclosure carefully. He would talk to her in a soft voice. He would bring her special treats. He watched her with a kind of quiet sadness. Every day, he was caring for a living piece of history that was about to become just history. The image was clear and heartbreaking. A single, quiet bird. Caring man. The immense weight of what her life represented. For years, there had been a reward, Miho continued. A large sum of money for anyone who could find a mate for Martha. They sent expeditions into the old forests. They put notices in newspapers. They begged farmers to report any sighting. They hoped somewhere a male passenger pigeon was still flying. A last hope. He paused. The hope in the story felt thin and desperate, even now. No one ever came forward. The forests were silent. The telegraph wires carried no messages about pigeon sightings anymore. The market hunters had moved on to other things. The machine had finished its work and stopped. The silence was complete. Miho's voice dropped to almost a whisper. The entire galactic audience leaned in, their forms still in the dark. So Martha lived alone. She became a curiosity. People would come to the zoo just to see her, to point and say, "That's the last one." They didn't see a bird. They saw a ghost. They saw the idea of the last one. It made them feel something strange, a mix of guilt and wonder. He then described a specific day, September 1st, 1914, a warm, late summer day. Quan came in the morning. He cleaned. He refilled her water. He put out fresh food. Martha sat on her perch. She did not eat. She was very still. Quan watched her for a long time. He had seen this stillness growing. The story was now moving minute by minute. The delegates could feel the ending approaching. It was a quiet, simple ending. There would be no explosion, no final battle. In the afternoon, around 1 o'clock, Quan checked on her again. She was on the floor of the enclosure. She was not moving. He unlocked the door and went inside. He knelt down. He touched her feathers. She was gone. Miho said the next words with absolute clarity, spacing them out. At that moment, the species Ectopus migratorius ceased to exist. What was once a number beyond counting became 0, from billions to 1, and then from 1 to none. The finality of it was a physical thing in the chamber. A gaseous nebulan delegate swirled slowly, its colors dimming to a mournful gray. A Vree diplomat's delicate antennae drooped. They put Martha's body on ice. They sent it by train to the Smithsonian Institution, a museum. Scientists studied her. They preserved her with chemicals. They put her in a glass case. You can go and see her there today. A small, stiff bird behind glass. A label tells her name and her date of death. It is a monument to an absence. Miho stopped speaking for a full minute. The weight of the story settled over everything. It was not a story of war, but of erosion. It was not a murder, but a fading. We killed her, Miho said finally, the words simple and blunt in the quiet. Not with hate, not with violence, with inattention, with the assumption that the world was ours to use without limit. We did not see her as Martha until she was the only one left. And by then, all we could do was watch her be still. He lifted his head, as if looking at the unseen delegates in the dark. That is our foundation, that stillness, that moment when Quan knelt on the floor of a cage, touching the last of something. We have a word for it. Solastalgia. The pain of seeing your home change for the worse, right in front of you. We felt it for a whole world. We learned it from a bird. He closed the old diary in his hands with a soft, final sound. We promised ourselves after Martha that we would never be that blind again, that we would learn to see the Martha in everything, in a forest, in an ocean, in a single insect, to see it before it becomes the last one. That is the lesson. That is the story we carry. That is the first thing we teach our children about being human. He fell silent. The presentation was over. The story was told. In the darkness, the Galactic Council could only stand there, or sit there, or float there in shock. It was not the shock of terror. It was the deeper, more terrible shock of understanding a specific, quiet kind of pain, and realizing an entire civilization had built its soul around remembering it. The lights in the great chamber did not come up. The darkness remained, thick and full of the story's echo. The image of Martha, the last quiet bird, seemed to hang in the air between the delegates and the two small humans on the floor, and no one moved. No one spoke. The silence was not like the silence before. That had been a silence of waiting. This was a silence of absorption. It was a heavy, thoughtful quiet. For a very long time, the only sound was the almost imperceptible hum of the environmental systems. Miho stood perfectly still, the old diary held gently in both hands. Jisoo stood beside him, her eyes fixed straight ahead, waiting. She could feel the weight of thousands of alien gazes. Finally, a soft, rustling sound came from the high seat of Counselor Vel. The ancient reptilian shifted. When he spoke, his translated voice was slow, each word chosen with care. It held none of its usual formal tone. It sounded almost personal. You offer this. Vel began, the words seeming to stumble. You offer this story of an ending, as your qualification. Miho nodded, a simple movement in the gloom. We do. It is a testament to your failure, Vel stated. It was not an accusation. It was a question, a request for clarification. It is a record of our failure, Miho agreed. Preserved, taught, remembered. It is the bedrock of our conscience. Another long pause. From somewhere in the tiers, a delegate spoke. Its voice was a series of rapid clicks and buzzes. The universal translator rendered it into cold, logical words. The data is irrational. You present weakness. You present a lack of control over your own ecosystem. This is not advancement. This is regression. Miho turned his head slightly toward the sound. Is it weakness to look clearly at your own mistake? Or is it weakness to hide from it, to forget it, to let it happen again in a different form? A different delegate, one of the crystalline silica, made a sound like a soft chime. The translator interpreted the meaning, not the sound. The story induces sadness. It is a pain signal. You build your identity on a pain signal. We build our identity on the truth, Miho replied. The pain is part of the truth. To ignore it would be a lie. We decided, after Martha, that we would rather live with an uncomfortable truth than a comfortable lie. The chamber buzzed with soft, untranslated noises. The delegates were communicating with their own kinds, a susurrus of clicks, hums, and pulses of light. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a frantic, quiet debate. Counselor Vel raised a scaled hand. The murmuring ceased. "Ambassador," he said, "every species that sits here today passed a test. They showed mastery of energy, of space, of social order. They showed they had overcome their primal struggles. You show us a struggle you lost." Miho took a small step forward. "With respect, Counselor, did they overcome their struggles? Or did they just get better tools? A species that masters energy but not its own appetite is just a more powerful consumer. A species that masters social order by silencing all conflict is just a quieter machine." He looked around the dark shapes. "You have judged civilizations by their tallest peaks. We are asking you to consider the depth of our valleys, and our will to never dig another." A new voice cut through the dark. It was sharp, coming from a delegate of a warrior species, a bipedal creature with a rigid, armored crest. "This is philosophy, poetry. The universe is not safe for poets. It is a place of force. You show us a dead bird. What will you show the Vorax when their war fleet enters your system? A diary?" For the first time, Jisoo, the aide, moved. She did not step forward, but her chin lifted. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and firm, ringing in the silence. "We will show them what we have shown you," she said, "and then we will show them what we built after." All attention shifted to her. "We saw the end of something infinite," Jisoo continued. "It broke something in us. And from that broken place we made a new rule. The first rule. See the Martha in everything. See the last one coming. And act." She turned her head toward the warrior delegate's general direction. "You speak of the Vorax war fleet. A fleet is a thing you can see. An enemy is a thing you can understand. How do you fight an idea? The idea that there is always more? That idea is the most dangerous enemy in the universe. It is quiet. It is invisible. And we have already fought it. We have looked it in the eye. We know its cost." Her words fell into a new silence. This was a different kind of shock. It was the shock of a perspective so alien, so inverted, that it required the brain to turn itself inside out to comprehend. Miho spoke again, gently pulling the focus back. "We are not asking for membership because we are perfect. We are asking because we are aware. We carry the scar of Martha so we never have to carry the scar of a dead ocean, or a dead forest, or a dead world. Our qualification is not our power to take. It is our discipline to stop." He looked up toward Counselor Vel's podium. "You asked for a summary of what humanity brings. We bring a question we learned from an empty sky and a bird in a cage. The question is, what does it mean to be a good citizen? Not just of a city or a nation, but of a living world. We have spent our years since Martha trying to answer that. We offer that struggle. We offer that question. It is the most valuable thing we have." Miho stopped talking. He had nothing else to say. The case was made. Counselor Vel stared down, his old eyes gleaming in the low light. The human had not brought charts of weapons or promises of tribute. He had brought a ghost, and he had argued that this ghost was the source of their strength. It was madness. It was brilliance. It was horrifying. It was hopeful. The presiding officer slowly straightened in his seat. The time for debate was over. The time for judgment had arrived. "The presentation is concluded," Vel announced, his formal tone returning, but changed, burdened by what he had heard. "The council will now convene in private to deliberate. The delegates for Earth will wait." A section of the wall behind Miho and Jisoo shimmered, revealing a small, plain waiting room. Without a word, the two humans turned and walked into it. The doorway sealed behind them, leaving the Galactic Council alone in the dark with the story of a bird and a profound, unsettling silence that demanded a verdict. The door to the small waiting room sealed without a sound. Inside, the light was soft and white. There were two simple chairs. Miho sat down slowly, placing the old diary on his lap. Jisu remained standing for a moment, her back straight, listening. But the chamber was designed for privacy. They heard nothing. She finally sat. "Do you think they understood?" she asked, her voice quiet in the sterile space. Miho looked at the plain wall that hid the galaxy from them. "I think they felt it. Understanding will take longer." Outside, in the vast chamber, the lights rose to a gentle glow. The private deliberations of the Galactic Council were not shouts and arguments. They were a series of focused telepathic exchanges, data stream connections, and chemical signal broadcasts. But the result was a rising tide of conversation. The warrior delegate who had spoken, a Krell named Gorv, was the first to project his thoughts to the general network. "This is sentiment, not strength. Their history shows a lack of control. They are emotional, volatile. They will be a liability in any galactic conflict." From the silica block, a slow, crystal-clear thought emerged. Felt like cool water. "We have analyzed the emotional payload of the narrative. Carries profound grief and a corrective algorithm. They have integrated a catastrophic error into their core identity. This is not volatility. It is a stability based on acknowledged trauma. We have no analogous cultural artifact." The Vri diplomat, whose people understood collective action, clicked and buzzed to its neighbors. The translation filtered through. They identified a systemic failure in their own swarm behavior. They then hard-coded the memory of that failure to prevent repetition. This is advanced societal metacognition. It is the opposite of liability. It is predictive defense. Gorv the Krell pulsed with irritation. Defense against what? Sad stories? The Vorax will eat their stories and then eat their worlds. A new voice entered. It was from the Nebulan, a being of swirling intelligence. Its colors shifted to a thoughtful, deep blue as it communicated. "The human did not ask us to admire their sadness. They asked us to consider their learning. The Vorax are a problem of force. The problem the humans identified, the silent, incremental consumption of a resource believed to be infinite, is a far more common and insidious galactic disease. How many pre-space species have consumed their own biospheres? How many empires have collapsed by repeating the same pattern of endless growth? The humans claim to have found an antibody for that disease." The debate turned. It was no longer about the dead bird. It was about the idea behind it. A delegate from a species of perfect societal harmony, the Alara, spoke. Their voice was a single, beautiful chord. "We achieved peace by eliminating conflict. We removed desire. We removed want. The human path is different. They kept their desire. They kept their hunger. But they built a cage of memory around it. They point their own appetite at themselves and say, 'Stop. This is a more difficult path.' It is a conscious, daily struggle. It is not calm, but it is robust." Counselor Vel listened, his ancient mind weighing each point. He had seen empires rise on pillars of fire. He had seen them crumble into dust. He had never seen one built on the memory of a single, extinct animal. He finally activated his amplifier, his old voice resonating through the chamber. "The question before us is not if humanity is powerful. It is not if they are peaceful. The question is, what is the quality of their consciousness? What do they add to the collective mind of this council?" Gorv responded immediately. "They add fragility. They celebrate a failure." The silica delegate chimed again. "They add a mirror showing a danger many of us are too advanced to perceive. We mastered our environments so long ago we forgot they could be fragile. We forgot the taste of scarcity. They remember it so vividly it shapes their laws. This mirror has value. It shows us a blind spot." The Nebulan swirled in agreement. "Our civilizations are old. We are expert at managing what we know is finite. But are we wise enough to see the finite in what appears infinite? The humans, with their painful history, might be. They could be the canary in the coal mine for the entire galaxy. The phrase, translated literally, confused many. The Nebulan clarified, an early warning system for a different kind of threat. Not missiles, but mistakes. The discussion went on. Some argued for traditional metrics, technological benchmarks, military readiness, historical stability. But the human presentation had poisoned that well. Everyone now saw those metrics differently. A powerful species without the Martha principle was just a bigger barrel, a faster train, a wider telegraph network. They were a scaled-up version of the problem. Counselor Vell felt a strange conviction forming. It was not about pity for the humans. It was about cold, galactic necessity. The universe had plenty of smart species. It had plenty of strong species. It had a dire shortage of wise ones. And wisdom, he was starting to believe, was often born from the clear, unflinching memory of a great and terrible mistake. He called for a preliminary vote. It was a vote of intent, not final. All in favor of proceeding to a final membership vote for humanity, based on the qualitative merits of their presented consciousness, indicate now. A galaxy of minds made their choice. Lights glowed on his console. Symbols flashed. He watched the tally build. It was not unanimous. Gorv and a block of similarly minded species voted against. But the number in favor was overwhelming. The Silica, the Nebulans, the Vri, the Alara, and hundreds of others saw something new, something necessary. The shock of the story had been a catalyst. It had broken their old categories. Now, in the broken space, they saw a potential new strength. A strength of restraint. A strength of memory. A strength built not on forgetting their darkness, but on forever carrying its lesson into the light. Counselor Vell looked at the result. He thought of the small, stiff bird in a museum case. He thought of the quiet sky. He opened a channel to the waiting room. Ambassador Miho. His voice echoed in the small space. The council is ready to deliver its verdict. The door to the waiting room dissolved. Miho stood, picking up the diary. Jisu rose beside him. They exchanged one look. It was calm. They had done all they could. They walked back into the great chamber. The lights were at full brightness now, revealing the vast assembly in all its strange and wonderful detail. Every eye, sensor, and receptive surface was fixed on them. The silence was a held breath. Counselor Vell stood at his podium. He looked older somehow, as if the story had added weight to his years. He waited until the humans reached the same spot in the center of the floor. Ambassador Miho. Aide Jisu. Vell began, his voice formal, yet carrying a new tone. It was not the cold voice of a judge. It was the measured voice of a historian stating a fact. The Galactic Council has deliberated. Miho bowed his head slightly. Jisu did the same. The vote, Vell continued, has been concluded. The application of humanity for full membership is hereby put to the final count. He did not look at a screen. He held the human's gaze. By a majority of 87%, the vote is in favor. The words hung in the air. They were simple words. They were the words Miho and Jisu had hoped for, worked for their entire careers. Yet, hearing them now, after the story of Martha, they felt different. This was not a victory of conquest. It felt like an acceptance of a burden. A soft, resonant sound filled the chamber. It was not applause. It was a collective, species-specific acknowledgement from hundreds of worlds. A hum from the Vri, a harmonic chord from the Alara, a shimmer of light from the Silica. It was a sound of welcome, but a solemn one. That Miho felt a tightness in his chest release. He nodded again, deeply this time. Thank you, Counselor. Thank you, esteemed delegates. Humanity accepts with humility. But Vell was not finished. He raised a scaled hand, asking for more than just thanks. Your presentation was unprecedented, Vell said, choosing the word carefully. You did not show us your power. You showed us your pain. You did not ask us to admire your peak, but to understand your valley. He stepped down from his podium. This was against protocol. The presiding officer never left the high seat during a formal declaration. The chamber watched, utterly still, as the ancient reptilian walked slowly across the smooth floor until he stood before Miho. He was taller, older, a being from the stars. But he looked at the human with an expression that transcended species. Respect. We have members who can crack planets, Vel said, his voice now quiet, for them alone, yet amplified for all to hear. We have members who can weave thoughts into music. We have members who live for 10,000 of your years. We thought these were the qualifications for civilization. He looked at the simple book in Miho's hands. You have shown us another, the qualification of memory, the strength to take the worst thing you have ever done, and to let it be the foundation for everything you do next. You carry your error not as a hidden shame, but as a guiding light, a warning light. Vel looked from Miho to Jisu, and then back to the diary. In a universe of infinite fragile things, he said, his voice growing stronger, ringing through the silent chamber, that awareness, that painful, careful awareness, is the most powerful thing you could have brought to this council. More powerful than any engine, more valuable than any resource. You bring us the story of the empty sky, and you remind us to look up and to truly see what is still there. He then did something no one had ever seen. He placed his scaled, three-fingered hand over his own chest, then extended it, palm open, toward Miho. It was not a human gesture. It was his species' highest sign of personal esteem, of seeing another as a true bearer of wisdom. The council welcomes you, Fel said, the formal words now infused with profound meaning. Not because you are flawless, but because you are aware of the price of breaking things. Welcome, guardians of the memory. The resonant sound in the chamber swelled, warmer now. The shock had finally melted. It had transformed into something else. A deep, galactic recognition. Miho, touched to his core, did not know the correct alien gesture in return. So he simply placed his own hand over his heart and bowed his head once more. Jisu did the same, her eyes bright. The ceremony was over. The procedural lights came on. Delegates began to move, to communicate, to approach. But for a long moment, Miho and Jisu just stood there. They had come to be judged, and they had been seen. Truly seen. Not for their ships or their cities, but for the scar they carried and the promise it held. As the first delegates, the Silica and the Nebulan, approached to offer their own welcomes, Miho looked down at the small, worn diary. He thought of the incomprehensible number of birds. He thought of the single, still form on the floor of a cage. He thought of a man named Quan, kneeling in grief. He closed his eyes for a second. He sent the thought out, like a prayer across the light years to a blue-green world. We did it, Martha. We told them, and they listened. He placed the diary back into its case. The past was sealed. The future, for humanity in a galaxy that now understood the weight of an empty sky, was just beginning. And everyone, human and alien alike, stood there in the quiet, hopeful shock of that new beginning.